So, in my Inner Life series, specifically in the first video of the extremely long chapter titled A New Friend, I put forward the suggestion that Princess Zelda was going to fall in love with the noble griffin Dalamar. And I want to unpack that a little bit and lay out my case, because I realize this is a very, very odd suggestion. The Zelda games have occasionally brought up the idea of interspecies love, but it's been between humans and Zoras, usually. Or in the case of Tears of the Kingdom, these, like, tank girl-looking kangaroo people. Don't worry, that's not a spoiler. They set that up in the opening cutscene of the game. But a human being falling in love with a quadruped, even if they are both of human-level intelligence, is weird. I think we can all agree it's weird. And while I do genuinely believe that this is where the story was going, here's the thing. I'll never know if I was right or if I was wrong, because the story doesn't keep going. Like most fan fiction, it is incomplete. It just kind of stops. Some fanfic, like Legolas by Laura, ends mid-sentence. This one ends with a new chapter heading and no actual chapter, unless you want to count the footnotes. Fanfiction is typically published one chapter at a time as a kind of ongoing performance, and it is typically written by people who, and this is not an insult here, but is typically written by people who don't have much experience or discipline with writing. And so it will very rarely follow the kind of beginning, middle, end structure of a typical novel. It is rarely written with an end point in mind or an idea of how to get there. And being generous, I will say that it will usually follow more the structure of an episodic TV series, because it is consumed like an episodic TV series, a chapter or two at a time, by a fan base, hopefully, a readership, who are coming back to the story week after week. So checking in with the characters and seeing what's going on and just getting new content is often enough. And it doesn't need to have the high standards of a well-plotted story with an endpoint in mind. And so, with the exception of a few masters of the form, like King Arthur II, most fanfiction doesn't end. It just kind of stops, usually on a cliffhanger, instead of with a, planned out climax and resolution. My Inner Life is not an exception. Of course, Jen, claimed in the author's notes that she knew exactly where the story was going, that she had the whole thing planned out because it came to her in her dreams, but I don't entirely believe that. Like, I will believe that she had a bunch of dreams where she lived in Hyrule and was married to Link, and that may have inspired the story. Maybe she really is a lucid dreamer. I don't know. But the story does not feel planned out to me. There are too many plot holes that she would have caught. There are too many things that are not set up until the last moment that they become relevant. For example, the idea of griffins existing in this world, because they are not in any of the games. And she only mentions that griffins exist in this world in the chapter where we meet a griffin. Whereas if she'd planned the whole thing out, they probably would have been mentioned just in passing as a bit of world building several chapters beforehand. And because of where the story ends, it's very easy to think of, and I've seen a lot of people discussing the story online described in these terms, thinking of the story thread with Dalamar and the war against the Dark Lord Ariakas as where the story finally gets going. And I don't know if I agree with that. I think that if Jen had written another 10 chapters or so, the Dark Lord Ariakas would have been faced and destroyed, and the story would have kept going. I think that he was probably just going to be another villain like Dark Link, who would be faced episodically, a rising action, and then it would be resolved and the story would keep going until another threat came along. I think the closest thing that Jen ever had in mind as an end point to the story, as a climax to the whole thing, was what we eventually saw in Mother Goddess. Ganondorf somehow returning, because he's clearly the end boss of this whole thing. It is frequently mentioned that in the story that Ganondorf might somehow return. This was not all going to climax with a battle against some 2-bit Dragonlance reject. And honestly, just as a bit of a side note, I think that the idea of a more episodically structured, sprawling fantasy story with lots of plot threads and subplots where crises come and go, villains rise and fall, and the main through line is just the main characters and their growth over a period of time, could be really interesting if you did it right. And that's why I, in spite of all of its flaws, which have been well documented, I really liked Dragon Age 2. I want to be very clear here that an episodic story is not necessarily a bad thing. So, imagining what was going to happen, planned to happen after My Inner Life, or at least after what we have of My Inner Life, is purely speculative, but I do believe that Jen was at least considering the idea of a romance between Zelda and Dalamar. And I would like to make my case for that, and for your benefit and convenience, I have laid out my points in a numbered list. Point number 1. Tiger-like cries. One of the most infamous elements of this story is, of course, Jen's tendency to make use of tiger imagery during the sex scenes. Now, of course, Griffin is half lion. Lions are very closely related to tigers. I think it is very safe to say that, to Jen, a big cat was a potent sexual symbol, one she clearly was fascinated by, given how frequently it comes up. And I'm told that she later got big into furry stuff. I can't 100% confirm that, but it tracks. So I think it is not outside the realm of possibility that Jen would want to explore the idea of a griffin's sexuality in a bit of detail, even though within the story as written, Dalamar never shows any explicit sexual or romantic interest in anyone. Point 2. The bouquet. You remember this bit at the wedding?
Then I turned my back and threw the bouquet over my shoulder. Everyone reached to grab it, but it was Princess Zelda that caught it. Ugh. I looked at her, and a smile crossed my rosy face as I winked. She would be the next to wed.
Of course you do. So it is very easy to imagine that Jen just forgot about this. Entirely plausible. But I think it does show that she was at least open to the possibility of writing in a love interest for Zelda, of giving Zelda some kind of romantic subplot. Although, if I'm right, it would be the only time in the entire story that she plants the seeds for something that will happen later on. So that's a big if. Point 3. The moment. So it is actually extremely rare in this story for two characters to have any kind of meaningful interaction and neither of them be Jenna. Jenna is the focal point of everything that happens on the page, and she is the narrator. So the world of the story is related to us as she perceives it. And that makes moments like this one all the more exceptional. "You honor us with your presence, O noble Griffin,"
Zelda said as she bowed to Dalamar. He looked at her, his gaze softening upon the look of Zelda's rosy face. He lowered his head, his crystal blue eyes staring down into hers.
That is not just a throwaway interaction to drive the story forward. Even if you disagree with the conclusions I am coming to, and that is, I want to be clear, an entirely reasonable position to take, but even if you disagree, I think we can all agree that Jen definitely wanted there to be some kind of a connection in this moment between Zelda and Dalamar. Maybe it's not romantic, maybe it's not sexual, maybe it is just the bond of mutual respect between two leaders who will become increasingly reliant on each other as allies in the war to come against the Dark Lord Ariakis. Maybe, but something deliberate is happening here.
"Thank you, milady. I appreciate all that you've done for me," Dalamar said, his gaze soft upon hers.
And if Jen was indeed planning on giving Zelda a love interest, horrifying though this may be, Dalamar is the only candidate who makes any kind of sense because he is by far the strongest connection Zelda has, to any other character in the story except for Jenna, her dad, and Impa. And remember, gay people don't seem to exist in this story's world, so there's not much chance of her getting together with, like, Ruda or Malon. So that's all I've got. And it may not be the most persuasive case ever, or the most extensive. I probably spent more time on the preamble talking about the episodic nature of most fanfiction than I did on the actual numbered list. But I think there's something there. And maybe Jen was planning on introducing a cool new human, or I guess half-elven guy that Zelda could fall in love with again. I don't know. I will never know. But I suspect that Jen wanted to write a freaky interspecies love story going on in the sidelines of the main love story, but maybe she, realized how weird that was, got a little embarrassed, a little self-conscious. Writing any kind of love story, and especially any kind of sexual fantasy, is a deeply personal thing. And if you like something that's maybe a little bit offbeat, like a human being falling in love with a griffin, I could see a person being a little bit hesitant to share that with the world. Maybe it was that hesitancy of writing that part that made her abandon the entire story. I don't know. On the other hand, she did write a scene where the main characters drink each other's pee, and that wasn't a problem for her, so who knows? We'll never know. But that's why people write fan fiction in the first place, isn't it? To imagine a story they know keeping going, or going in a different direction, to look past the boundaries of what was created and go beyond those boundaries. You fall in love with characters, with a world. You want to imagine what would happen if it kept going beyond what the creators put in. Jen fell in love with Link, with the land of Hyrule, and she wanted to imagine his life after the credits of the game rolled. If things could just keep going, if he could just keep hanging out in this amazing land of adventure and have new adventures beyond what was programmed in. If people could come into Hyrule from other places and leave Hyrule for other places. If new things could keep happening like they do in real life. She wanted not just a construct, but a living, breathing world that kept going on its own. And I guess that's what I am doing here. Because, for better or for worse, my inner life has been a huge part of my own actual life since 2007. And, it's a bad story, but in spite of that, I do find myself poking at the boundaries, peeking over the edges. I find myself wondering what would have happened next. What if new things kept happening in this crappy, poorly thought out world? So my big question is, does Dalamar have a horrifying hooked penis like a tiger, or does he have more of a cloaca like an eagle? I will always wonder. God help us in the future.
A huge thank you, as always, to the Mutant Museum's generous supporters, particularly Michael Fattori, Break System BSE, Zanazira, and Zachary Snowden-Smith. A special thank you to Zachary Snowden-Smith as well for supporting me on Ko-fi, in addition to Patreon. Ko-fi is just for one-time donations, so if a Patreon monthly thing is too big of a commitment, please do consider throwing me a few dollars here and there on Ko-fi if you enjoy these videos. Next week, we will be beginning our new series on the Eye of Argon. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and thanks for being you.